please tell us a little bit history about Tibetan Buddhism.
Well, the history of Buddhism in Tibet began around the 8th century. And it was very unique in that Tibet is near, I mean, it borders Nepal and India, but there's a barrier of the high Himalayas, the snow mountains. So one name for Tibet is the land of snows because the altitude is very high and it's surrounded by some of the highest mountains in the world. So it wasn't an easy thing for Buddhism to go to Tibet. It took a lot of courage over many centuries, actually, to bring the Buddhist traditions to Tibet. And one really important thing is that before Buddhism in Tibet, there was an animistic tradition called Bön. But there wasn't a written language. As far as we know, they developed a language especially for conveying Buddhism. So what that meant was that the words were completely devised or created in order to convey the meanings of Buddhism. Whereas, for example, in China, they already had a very highly evolved philosophical system in Confucianism. They also had Taoism. So every word that they used to translate Buddhism already had a meaning of its own. Those meanings, those Taoist and Confucian meanings, gave a particular flavor to Buddhism in China. In Tibet, the field was open. When they created the Tibetan written language, of course they had a spoken language, but when they created the written language, they created it especially for Buddhism. And they wanted to be very careful to translate the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, as accurately as possible, word for word. So this is really quite brilliant because now when we read the Tibetan, we can almost understand what the original Sanskrit meaning was. You see what I mean? So the words for wisdom and compassion and for ethics and so forth were created especially for that purpose, with that particular Buddhist meaning. So it means that Buddhism, when you read it in Tibetan, it's very clear, extremely clear. So I think that's something very special. Now, that being said, we can see that many different people were involved in the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet. From about the 8th century, they used to send all of their most intelligent young men to India to study. For women, it was considered too difficult to travel. But so they would send all of the most brilliant young men to India, where they would stay for 10 or 20 years to learn Sanskrit and to learn Buddhism, and then eventually to come back to Tibet to teach. So these monks studied with many different teachers in India. And by that time already, 1,500 years had gone by. So no religion stays fixed. Religions always evolve according to the needs of the time, according to different social and economic and political conditions. The same is true of Buddhism. So by the time Buddhism went to Tibet, it had many different forms, actually. You had some that looked very much like early Buddhism. You had Theravada, you had Mahayana. Within Mahayana, you had Sutrayana and Vajrayana. You had many different forms. So now you've probably heard the game where they play Arab telephone, where you sit in a circle and someone whispers to the person next to them a sentence. And that person whispers to the next person and then to the next person. And by the time it goes around the circle, sometimes the meaning has changed completely, right? So every time the Dharma was transmitted, it was transmitted according to the needs of the people, of the listeners, right? To the best ability with skillful means, they call it, with skillful means for the benefit of the student. And so we come out with a richness of traditions. The same principles, but different stories are used to convey these principles. So it's very rich, very interesting. You see? Yeah. And then in Tibet, also, these traditions continued to evolve, continued to develop until today. So, for example, someone might be trying to teach the dangers of attachment, right? The dangers of attachment. When we get attached to things, then when we lose them, we suffer a lot, right? So they could use different examples to convey attachment. Attachment to people is rather universal, but you might say attachment to these days when we teach, we might say, oh, attachment to coffee, or attachment to, your cell phone, or something that will make the teachings relevant to that time and place. You see? So this is what happened in Tibet too. They evolved stories to teach that were especially useful for that time and place for Tibet, right? They would use snow mountains, for example, as to illustrate, the teachings. And there were many great masters who came out of Tibet. Like, for example, the great master Milarepa. He was, first he learned some kind of black magic, and then he realized he was on the wrong path, and he found a true teacher, a sincere teacher, and he studied very hard for many years. And then he went up to the snow mountains with nothing, just with one cotton cloth. And he became very famous. He was a great poet. He has, a book with about 100,000 songs in it. And these are songs of his realization. So he's way up in the high Himalayas with nothing really, but his meditation. And so his songs, his stories are very meaningful. And they're set within this beautiful Himalayan geography. Very nice. And other teachers, of course, were living in monasteries. So that's another form of Buddhism. So you had many different forms that arose in Tibet itself.
Now we get to talk about some of the different variations of Tibetan Buddhism. I'm sure there are many schools of Tibetan Buddhism because it has a long history. So can you tell us some of the schools that we should know about, please?
Okay, right. So originally they say there were 8 major schools of Buddhism in Tibet, but today there are 4 main schools in existence today. Now the oldest one is called the Nyingma school. The Nyingma school is especially devoted to Guru Rinpoche, to Guru Pema Sambhava, and they practice teachings that were given by Pema Sambhava in the 8th century. And great masters who followed him up to today. The next school that arose is called the Sakya school. It's named after the Sakya region of Tibet, which is in western Tibet. And they had many great masters as well. The next school that arose was the Kagyu school. The Kagyu school were followers of Tilopa, Naropa, Milarepa, and so forth. In a lineage, also from India. And so this Kagyu school, it means the whispered teachings, the spoken teachings that they heard. So it's a kind of spoken lineage. But of course, today it's written down as well. The 4th major school is called the Gelug tradition. And this was founded by the great master Tsongkhapa, who had studied with the Nyingma teachers, Sakya teachers, and Kagyu teachers. And he drew from all of those schools. And he was a great scholar. And so he wrote many books, especially explaining things like compassion and wisdom or emptiness. And he wrote these down. He was also a great practitioner, and he had many, many followers. So these are the 4 major schools that we have today: Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, and Gelug. But according to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who practices all 4 of them, he says that the 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism are like 4 quarters of a plate of pure gold.